When you are citing from a play, you need to first determine whether those lines are prose or poetry. When citing Shakespeare, there's a good chance it's poetry, and should thus adhere to the rules of citing poetry. If it's prose, it would adhere to the rules of citing from a novel or a short story. Another unique thing about plays is that there is no narration. By definition, plays are entirely dialogue, with the exception of scene notes. So for quoting purposes, each line of dialogue in the play should be treated as if it were narration. If a character quotes another character, the rules of dialogue quotations would apply. So if we're quoting only one character and we can fit the quote in 3 or fewer lines, we begin by putting the selection within quotation marks as usual, including all internal punctuation. We're going to omit the end punctuation except for question marks and exclamation points, and we're going to make a parenthetical reference that includes the author's last name and then the act, the scene, and the line number. Drama differs from other types of literature in the citation, as you can see. You have to include the act first, followed by a period, the scene followed by a period, and then the line number or numbers. Use Arabic numerals unless your teacher specifically tells you to use the Roman numerals. Let's look at an example. I'll take a prose passage from The Merchant of Venice. With a play, your lead-in sentence has to indicate both the speaker and the context. Nerissa tries to convince Portia that the lottery is not as bad as she thinks. So my lead-in sentence, as you can see, contains information about the speaker, Nerissa, and the person to whom she's speaking, Portia. So now I quote, "Your father, was ever virtuous, and holy men at their death have good inspirations." Here we go. So that's the end of my quote. And now let's assume that I have used the author's name in a previous quote. In my parentheses, I'm going to have the act, which is Act 1, the scene, which is Scene 2, and then the lines, 27 to 28, end parentheses, period. It's that simple. Now let's see how it looks when I quote verse. As we did when we quoted from a poem, we indicate the end of a line of verse with a slash surrounded by spaces. So let's look at an example of that. And I begin with my lead-in sentence. Antonio sets himself above Shylock when he discusses his own lending practices. Okay, begin my quote with the quotation marks. Shylock, albeit I neither lend nor borrow. Now it's the end of a line, so I do space slash space, by taking nor by giving of excess. Another end of line, yet to supply the ripe wants of my friend. Yet another line, I'll break a custom. And then the end of the quote. My citation, this is from Act 1, Scene 3, lines 63 to 66, end parentheses, and then the period. Now you'll notice in here that I capitalized by, even though it's middle of the sentence, yet, and it's in the middle of the sentence. Well, why did I do that? Because Shakespeare did it, and if it's good enough for Shakespeare, then it's good enough for me. You have to quote accurately. So, let's say that you want to quote a conversation, not just one character. You must make it a block quote. There's no exception to that. And there are a couple of ways, steps to follow to do a block quote for a play. Okay, first of all, you're going to indent an additional 1 inch from the left margin like we do with all block quotes. So that's a total of 2 inches from the edge of the paper. Next, we're going to begin each part of the conversation with each character's names in all capital letters. We put a period after each character's name and then we type the quote. We begin the quotation including all punctuation. If the character's prose line, let's say you're quoting prose, and the line goes beyond the end of your typed line, you indent an additional 1/4 inch for all subsequent lines. And let's say it's a verse line and it goes too long. First of all, each line of verse that you quote in a block quote should be on its own line. But if you have one that seems really long, that goes really long, you're going to indent all subsequent ones an additional 1/4 inch. So all subsequent lines. The first line is just right after the period, and then all subsequent lines are an additional 1/4 inch if you're quoting verse. You're going to include all end punctuation, of course, and then the parenthetical citation immediately after the final words quoted. So let's look at an example. So I'm going to begin by setting my margin up here to an additional 1 inch so that I've got a full 2 inches from the edge of the paper. Then I'm going to type the character that I'm quoting, his name, in all caps, followed by a period, and then I'm going to begin my typing. Come, bring me unto my chance. Alright, and the next one is Portia, so she gets her own line as well, all caps, followed by that period. First, forward to the temple, after dinner, your hazard shall be made. Now, this is 2 lines, so remember, and I'm quoting verse here, so each verse line gets its own line, and each additional line should be indented another 1/4 inch. So I'm going to put a little caret there and then just hit tab. Now I go back to Morocco, whoops, and I type the rest of his quote. Good fortune then. And then the next line, to make me blessed. Cursedest among men. That is not my misspelling, that is Shakespeare's words. Okay, and then you remember that I need to indent this line an additional 1/4 inch, so I'm going to just tab that over. And then I include my citation right here on the end of the line. And I do not include punctuation after it. Now you can see that I've tried to reproduce the text as it appears in the play. So when the lines don't begin right after the name, you can see here we have one that begins right after the name. But typically or not typically, but periodically they won't, as in this example. That's because an earlier line, and we're citing verse, probably ended right about here. And because of that, the next line, in order to make it fit the verse pattern, will begin tabbed over a little bit. So what you need to do is to duplicate the spacing to the best of your ability. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it should be close to the eye. So you see this line, your hazard shall be made, good fortune then. These 2 lines equal 1 line of iambic pentameter, and so this line completes this line, and that's why it starts this far over. So that's quoting from a play.